continuing with our quick and dirty introduction to ethical decision-making frameworks. Of course, we'll be going into our deeper dive on each of these three theories: Kantianism, utilitarianism, and Thomas Aquinas' natural law approach. This is the second one, utilitarianism. All I've given you here in terms of text is the greatest happiness principle, which appears in John Stuart Mill's book, Utilitarianism. And it is what is it? It's a definition of the good. The good is happiness, by which he means pleasure. And bad or evil is unhappiness or pain. So what that gives us is a pretty clear rule of behavior. Do that which produces the most happiness and avoids causing pain or unhappiness. It's actually fairly simple, I guess. But if you click on, and I hope you do, look through the page about consequentialism, of which utilitarianism is by far the most prominent form of consequentialism, you'll see that there are complications, that there are difficulties with the theory, and those are things that we'll pick up later in the semester, perhaps. But from this, especially this rule here, you can derive a certain procedure, you might say, for dealing with a moral issue. I want to just start right here. If the good is, and let's just say for the moment, human happiness, and evil is unhappiness, we should always, well, what is the rule? Mill doesn't actually give you the rule of action. He defines the good, and he defines the good as pleasure or happiness, and evil as pain or unhappiness. He leaves it to us to supply the kind of precept that we actually get from Kant or Thomas Aquinas. It's fairly easy to do, but it's an important issue. We'll see when we actually read the book. But we can derive, at least temporarily, a certain rule, ethical rule that he's given us to follow. It's fairly simple. Always do that which maximizes happiness and minimizes unhappiness. Presumption is that we want the best outcome. And the best outcome would be the one which maximizes happiness. So how do we actually do that, though? This is the difficulty, right? I mean, it is still rather vague in terms of being a useful direction, a useful rule to follow, because we know that, generally speaking, the results of our actions should be the ones which, in the circumstances, maximize happiness and minimize unhappiness. So, but how do you go about applying that rule in any particular case? Well, the best advice I can give you, and perhaps this is advice that comes from outside of John Stuart Mill, the work to be looking at, but in any particular situation, you really need to determine whose interests are actually at stake. Because most of what we do affects particular people, and not a lot. But not unless we're legislators or doing things that are things that have wide and deep, profound results, most of the time what we do is fairly local and small scale. So what we need to do is determine whose interests are actually at stake. Which means basically who will actually be affected by our action. And that has to be done on a case by case basis. And that includes yourself, and there's nothing wrong with that. That is, you are one of the people who will be affected by your action. That is, whose happiness will be impacted by your actions. So basically, you can always include yourself in that. Right? That is, it would seem that in what I do, most of the time, the most prominent person is myself, in the sense that I will be most affected in terms of my happiness and unhappiness or my general welfare most by my actions. So always include yourself. That is, when you're thinking about whose interests are at stake. But crucially, don't give yourself any more, importance than anyone else. That is, don't privilege your own happiness over anybody else's. And that is the principle of equity, or the now, of course, not everyone is affected to the same extent by an action, right? That is, it may be that one of your actions, it may affect a number of people, but not all to the same extent. So it's quite possible to have a more or less immediate interest. It may be that, yes, my action affects someone else, but it may affect me more profoundly. So in that case, it's okay to give myself more importance because I'm more importantly affected. Someone else is affected, but still their interest needs to be taken into account. So it is an art, as we'll see in utilitarianism, just as it's an art in ethics in general, to actually apply a general principle. It is. This is what casuistry is. This is much of what the course is about: is using our judgment in order to apply a moral principle in the best way, the most correct way.